The first thing I heard was shouting. Not just annoyed shouting, the kind that makes neighbors peek through curtains and kids stop riding their bikes. I stepped outside and saw her standing across the street, phone pressed tightly to her ear, pointing straight at my yard like she had just uncovered some major crime. That was the moment I knew trouble had arrived. What she didn't know, and what would completely change the story, was that the so-called police training happening on my lawn wasn't illegal, dangerous, or secretive. It was approved, planned, organized, and supported by the very people she was trying to call in against us. But she didn't know that yet. Our neighborhood safety demo had started earlier that afternoon. A few local officers were showing families basic awareness techniques, emergency response tips, and how to stay calm in crisis situations. Kids were laughing. Parents were watching. Everything was calm and controlled. Then she appeared. Everyone knew her. The self-appointed rule enforcer. The one who watched everything from behind the blinds and turned minor misunderstandings into full-scale drama. And today, she looked furious. She marched closer, voice raised, demanding to know who authorized this operation. I calmly explained it was a community event, coordinated with local officials, and that flyers had been sent out days ago. She scoffed. "I didn't approve this," she said. That's when I realized this wasn't about safety or noise. This was about control. The officers tried to remain polite, explaining that the demonstration was completely within guidelines. But she wasn't listening. Her phone call continued, louder now, as she described the scene like it was some dangerous tactical exercise invading the neighborhood. Neighbors started gathering at a distance. Some whispered. Others shook their heads. The tension rose quickly. Minutes later, another patrol car pulled up. She smiled like she had just won. But when the officer stepped out and greeted the demo team like old colleagues, her expression changed. Confusion replaced confidence. She began arguing again, insisting this wasn't right, that no one had informed her, that this kind of activity shouldn't happen on private property. And then one officer calmly said something that made everyone go silent. "Ma'am, the police chief approved this himself." Her face froze. The crowd noticed. The officers exchanged knowing looks. And for the first time, she seemed unsure of what to say next. But this was only the beginning, because moments later, a familiar black SUV turned into the street, and everything shifted. The black SUV rolled slowly down the street, quiet but commanding attention. Conversation stopped. Kids stepped back toward their parents. Even the officers straightened slightly as the vehicle came to a halt near my driveway. The door opened, and out stepped the police chief. The energy changed instantly. The officers greeted him respectfully, while neighbors whispered among themselves, trying to figure out why someone that important was here in person. I already knew this demonstration had been his idea in the first place. He wanted stronger community trust, more awareness, and safer neighborhoods. But the woman who had called the HOA and the police looked completely unprepared. She adjusted her posture, trying to regain confidence, then marched forward as if she was about to present evidence in court. Finally, she said loudly, "Someone who can shut this down." The chief listened calmly, hands behind his back, watching the scene without interruption. She explained that there were officers in my yard, training activities happening near homes, and that residents felt unsafe. That last part made several neighbors exchange glances, because everyone knew most of us had volunteered to attend. The chief nodded politely and turned toward me. "How's attendance?" he asked casually. "Better than expected," I replied. He smiled. That single moment shifted the balance. Her face tightened. She realized this wasn't an investigation, it was a visit. A planned one. The chief began greeting families by name, checking in with officers, and discussing upcoming safety workshops. It was obvious he fully supported what was happening. She interrupted again, voice sharper now. But no one asked me. This is HOA property. A few people sighed quietly. The chief finally addressed her directly. Ma'am, he said patiently, this is a community partnership event. It was approved weeks ago with neighborhood coordination. She glanced around, suddenly aware that many neighbors were watching her argument unravel. But I called because this looked like police training, she insisted. It is, he answered. A safety demo for residents. The silence after that felt heavy. For a moment, she seemed lost, searching for another angle. Then she pulled out her phone and started mentioning HOA rules again: gatherings, permissions, liability, as if reading from an invisible rulebook that only she could see. The chief listened, calm as ever, then asked one simple question. Did you read the notice posted by the HOA board? Her expression froze again. Apparently, she hadn't. A few neighbors tried to hide their smiles. Others simply watched, fascinated by how quickly confidence had turned into uncertainty. But she wasn't finished. She took a step closer, lowering her voice, and said something that changed the mood completely. Well, I think this entire event is suspicious. The chief's smile faded slightly. The officers fell quiet. And suddenly, the situation felt far more serious than simple neighborhood drama. What happened next would leave the entire street speechless, and it started with the chief asking her to explain exactly what she meant. The street felt different now. The cheerful noise from the safety demo faded into cautious silence as everyone sensed the shift. The police chief stood calmly, waiting for her answer, while she hesitated, caught between backing down or pushing forward. She chose to push forward. I just think it's suspicious, she repeated, louder this time, glancing around like she expected people to agree with her. Officers in tactical gear, people gathering, activities in someone's yard, it doesn't look normal. The chief's expression remained neutral, but the officers nearby exchanged subtle looks. They had heard this tone before, accusations wrapped in concern. He nodded slowly. Can you explain what exactly concerns you? She paused again. For the first time, it seemed like she hadn't thought this far ahead. The crowd waited. Kids leaned against their parents. Someone's phone quietly recorded from across the street. Well, nobody told me personally, she said finally. And as someone who cares about this neighborhood, I feel responsible. I couldn't help but exhale. This wasn't about safety at all. It was about control, about being left out of something she couldn't manage. The chief turned to the group and addressed everyone, his voice calm but firm. This event, he said, was arranged to help residents feel more confident and prepared. It's voluntary, educational, and fully approved. We want stronger trust between police and community, not fear. Several neighbors nodded. A few even clapped softly. Her face flushed. She looked around, realizing the crowd wasn't supporting her. That's when she changed strategy. She suddenly pointed toward a training cone on the lawn. That equipment could hurt someone. What if there's liability? What if kids get injured? One officer stepped forward and gently explained how every station had safety measures, supervision, and clear boundaries. Families had signed participation forms. Everything was documented. The chief added, we've hosted this same demonstration in 3 other neighborhoods this month. No issues. That information hit hard. She clearly thought she had uncovered something unusual, but instead, she was the only one out of the loop. The tension in the air began to dissolve, replaced by quiet amusement among the neighbors. Someone whispered, she didn't even read the newsletter, and a few people chuckled. She heard it. Her eyes narrowed. This is why rules exist, she snapped. People think they can do whatever they want. The chief took a small step closer, lowering his voice but making every word count. Rules exist to help communities, he said, not to divide them. The statement landed like a turning point. Even she seemed stunned for a moment. And then, just when it looked like things might calm down, her phone rang. She answered quickly and her expression changed again. Whatever she heard made her straighten up and say loudly, "Fine. Then I want the HOA president here right now." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Because what she didn't realize was that the HOA president was already on the way, and had been informed about everything long before she made that call. The tension lingered in the air like a storm that refused to move on. Everyone waited, watching her pace near the curb while clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. She looked confident again, convinced that the arrival of the HOA president would finally prove her right. The police chief stood calmly near the officers, chatting with residents as if nothing dramatic had happened. Kids resumed small parts of the demo, but all eyes kept drifting back to the street. Then another car pulled in. The HOA president stepped out, folder in hand, scanning the scene with quiet curiosity. He greeted a few neighbors before walking toward us. The woman rushed forward immediately. "Thank goodness you're here," she said loudly. "I've been trying to explain that this entire thing is against HOA rules." He listened patiently, nodding while she spoke rapidly about unauthorized gatherings, liability concerns, and neighborhood standards. She talked faster and louder, like the more words she used, the more convincing she might sound. When she finally finished, everyone waited for his response. He opened the folder. Inside were printed notices, approval forms, and an event schedule all stamped and signed. "This demonstration," he said calmly, holding up the paper, "was approved at last month's board meeting." Silence. Even the birds seemed quieter. She blinked. "What?" He turned the page and continued. The announcement was included in the weekly newsletter and posted on the HOA website. Residents were invited to attend. A soft wave of laughter moved through the crowd, not mocking, just the release of tension that had built for over an hour. Her face shifted from confusion to disbelief. "No one told me," she insisted. The president raised an eyebrow. "Everyone received the same notice." The police chief crossed his arms, observing quietly. The officers avoided eye contact, clearly trying not to react. For a moment, she seemed frozen. Then she tried one last push. "Well, even if it's approved, it still disrupted the neighborhood." That's when multiple neighbors spoke up at once. One thanked the officers for teaching emergency response. Another said their kids were enjoying the educational activities. Someone else mentioned feeling safer knowing the community was working together. Each comment chipped away at her argument. The president closed the folder gently. "This event represents exactly what the HOA supports: safety, cooperation, and community engagement." Those words hit harder than anything before. She looked around and realized she was standing alone in her complaint. The chief stepped forward and smiled politely. "Ma'am, if you'd like, you're welcome to join the demo." The invitation was genuine, but it made her speechless. She opened her mouth to reply, then stopped. The crowd waited, curious about what she would do next. Instead of answering, she turned away sharply, muttering something under her breath. But before she could walk off, the HOA president said one more thing that stopped her in her tracks. "There's actually another matter we need to discuss, regarding repeated unnecessary complaints." The atmosphere shifted again. Heads turned. Phones came out. And suddenly, everyone realized the real conversation was just beginning. The words hung in the air like a sudden pause in music. Repeated unnecessary complaints. The moment the HOA president said it, the entire street seemed to lean in closer. Even the kids stopped moving, sensing something serious was unfolding. She turned slowly, disbelief written across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, voice sharper now. The HOA president remained calm, holding the folder at his side. "Over the past few months," he said carefully, "the board has received multiple reports about frequent emergency calls and complaints that were found to be unfounded. Her expression changed instantly from confidence to defensiveness. "I'm just trying to protect the neighborhood," she argued. "No one is questioning your intentions," he replied gently, "but repeated false or unnecessary reports create strain on resources and cause tension among residents." The police chief nodded subtly, confirming the point without saying a word. A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Some neighbors exchanged knowing looks. Others seemed relieved that someone had finally addressed what many had whispered about for months. She crossed her arms. "So now I'm being punished for caring." The president shook his head. "This isn't punishment. It's a conversation about communication and responsibility." He opened the folder again and showed her a few printed pages, logs of complaints, follow-up notes, and resolutions. Every incident had been reviewed. Most had ended with the same conclusion: no violation found. She stared at the papers, speechless for a moment. The chief finally stepped in, his tone respectful but firm. "When officers are called unnecessarily, it takes us away from real emergencies. That's why we encourage residents to verify concerns before escalating them." The truth landed heavily. Neighbors who had stayed silent until now began sharing small comments, not angry, just honest. One mentioned being embarrassed when officers arrived over a harmless family barbecue. Another said they stopped hosting gatherings because they feared complaints. The woman looked around, surprised to see how many people felt affected. "I didn't know," she murmured quietly. For the first time, her voice sounded uncertain rather than confrontational. The HOA president softened his expression. "That's why today is important. This event is about building trust, not breaking it." The atmosphere shifted from confrontation to reflection. The tension that once crackled through the street now felt calmer, almost hopeful. The chief gestured toward the demo area. "Community safety works best when we work together." She hesitated. Everyone watched, wondering what she would do. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of arguing again, she slowly nodded. Not fully agreeing, maybe, but no longer fighting. The crowd relaxed. Conversations restarted. Children returned to the activity stations. It felt like the conflict might finally be ending. But just as the moment settled, one officer walked over to the chief and whispered something. The chief looked surprised. Then he smiled slightly and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Looks like the local news heard about this and wants to stop by." The crowd reacted instantly: excitement, whispers, nervous laughter. And suddenly, what started as a neighborhood argument was about to become something much bigger. The news van arrived faster than anyone expected. Bright lights, a camera crew, and a reporter stepped onto the street, instantly turning our quiet neighborhood into something that felt bigger than all of us. Neighbors straightened their clothes. Kids whispered excitedly. Even the officers adjusted their posture. The woman who had started the entire chaos looked frozen again, clearly unsure whether to stay or disappear. The reporter approached the police chief first, asking about the community safety demo and why it had drawn so much attention. The chief explained calmly that the event was designed to help residents feel empowered, informed, and connected. It wasn't about enforcement, it was about partnership. As cameras rolled, families demonstrated what they had learned: basic emergency response, awareness drills, and communication tips. The scene looked positive, organized, and welcoming, nothing like the problem she had described earlier. Then the reporter asked the question no one expected. "We heard there was some initial concern from a resident. What happened?" The crowd went quiet again. The chief paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes misunderstandings happen," he said diplomatically. "What matters is that we talked, clarified, and moved forward together." It was a graceful answer, one that protected everyone's dignity. But the reporter turned toward the HOA president for more context. He briefly explained that the event had been approved and that the neighborhood was focused on cooperation. No drama, no blame, just facts. And then the camera shifted toward her. For a second, she looked like she might walk away. But something changed. Maybe it was the calm tone around her. Maybe it was realizing everyone else was moving forward. Slowly, she stepped closer. I thought something unsafe was happening, she admitted. I didn't understand what it was. The honesty surprised everyone, including me. The reporter nodded, sensing the story's real ending. And now? She glanced around at the smiling families, the officers laughing with kids, and the neighbors chatting peacefully. Now, I see it's good for the neighborhood, she said quietly. Applause broke out, small at first, then growing stronger. Not mocking, not sarcastic. Supportive. Forgiving. The chief smiled. That's what community looks like. As the sun started to dip, the demo wrapped up. Officers packed equipment. Families thanked them. The news crew gathered final shots of neighbors talking together, something that would have been impossible just hours earlier. Before leaving, the chief shook my hand and said, "This is exactly why we do these events." And the woman? She didn't storm off this time. She stayed, watching quietly, even helping stack a few chairs before leaving with a nod. The street felt different after that, lighter somehow. The conflict that began with accusations ended with understanding. Because in the end, the biggest lesson wasn't about police training, HOA rules, or who was right.
It was about quickly fear turns into unity when people actually talk to each other. And as the last patrol car drove away, I realized something surprising. The neighborhood wasn't divided anymore, it was finally together. Welcome to Karen Universe, where we dive into every wild, quirky, and intriguing story out there. If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.